Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to episode 29 of the podcast, and today we're going to be talking about the Ghost of Blackwood Hall. So this is book number 25 of the series, and it was first written in 1948, and this book, I am not going to lie, was a very creepy read. I remember looking at the cover as a kid and just being terrified. Now, we've actually got two different book covers to discuss when it comes to the Ghost of Blackwood Hall, and it was so neat. While I was reading this book, I actually went to a local used bookstore and I found the 1948 version. And so on the cover of this book, Nancy kind of looks like Belle or Alice. She's kind of got this blue and white dress. It's interesting how a lot of characters in popular media use those colors. It's just, I don't know, kind of eye-catching. And Nancy's got the blonde hair. They're outside of this very dilapidated looking house. I'm assuming it's Blackwood Hall. And George and Bess are in the bottom left-hand corner. I don't know. I think what strikes me the most about this book cover is that Nancy looks kind of like a Disney fairy tale princess. She's just not even scared at all. She just is like, I'm going to go up to the porch of this house and have my matching accessories. But she doesn't look as scared as she should. Now, the second edition of this cover is the one that I remember as a kid, and it was a very creepy cover because you have Nancy, Bess, and George kind of out of sight in the hallway looking into this room, and there's a ghostly figure at an organ, and it's green and really kind of ghastly looking, and George has got a flashlight, and they're just looking in there at this person, and I don't know, this was one of the first books that really actually just came out and was like, ghost. I mean, because they were talking about hauntings at Twin Elms and The Hidden Staircase, but this is one of the first books where they're just like, no, we're going to go with the ghostly specter spirit trope and just run with it. And I really think that Nancy, Bess, and George are represented really well in this cover. Like, they look how I've always pictured them to look. George has got the short black hair, Bess has the blonde hair, and Nancy has, like, bright red hair. But they look how I've always envisioned them to look. Also, if you'd ever like to see these book covers before the episode airs, I like to post these on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. So if you want to follow along over there, this is usually also where I post any kind of Nancy Drew memes and just funny content, so I'd love to see you guys over there. And I came up with a funny cover spoof because I like to do that just for these books, what I think the book should be called if I just had looked at it and had no idea what was in between the covers. And so the one that I came up with is The Mystery of Why Are There So Many Spooky Estates Around River Heights? Because we have Twin Elms, we have Blackwood Hall, there's a Lilac Inn. I mean, there's just so many different, it's just a funny trope in the Nancy Drew series. There's always kids who are orphaned and have horrible foster parents, or we've got, just these mansions and estates that are just dilapidated and we don't know where the people who own them are. And speaking of the crazy tropes that are all over the place in Nancy Drew books, I've actually been coming up with some bonus episodes for the podcast that I might dive into some of those tropes a little bit deeper and discuss some other things that I don't normally discuss in the regular episodes. So as soon as I get those available, I will let you guys know. But as far as a cover rating goes for these books, I gave these 5 magnifying glasses because I like the covers of these books. They're very colorful, and the second one in particular is very spooky. Now, I've got a list and cast of characters, and we're going to just jump right into it, but we, of course, have Nancy, Bess, and George, and Hannah and Carson make regular appearances throughout this book. But there is Mr. Freeman, who is a jeweler, Miss Putney, who is a widow, and that's the person we have been enlisted to help, Howard Brex, who is a jewel thief, and Lola White, who is a friend of Bess's and ends up being, unfortunately, taken advantage of by some not so savory characters. So without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis for The Ghost of Blackwood Hall. Nancy has Mr. Freeman, a jeweler, and Miss Putney call on her with a mystery. Miss Putney, a widow, says her dead husband appeared to her and said she could enlist the help of a girl, but not a woman or man. The same spirit supposedly also told her to bury her jewels in the woods, but when she dug them back up, they had been stolen and replaced by fakes. Nancy goes to where they were buried and sees something metal, but before she can investigate it, a woman screams, and when Nancy returns, the metal object is gone. Next, Nancy, Bess, and George follow a lead to New Orleans and attend a spooky seance, and Nancy receives a warning. She goes with Bess and George to check out a spiritual photographer and ends up getting kidnapped. Once she returns to River Heights, Nancy hears some things from Miss Putney that make her certain that the mediums she's been talking to are scamming her and other people out of their money. Nancy, Bess, and George go to Blackwood Hall and encounter ghostly specters, and when Nancy returns with Carson and Ned later, she sees more spooky apparitions and her dad's car is stolen. Nancy and Ned see Lola White, a friend of Bess's, walking in a trance into the water and figure out she's been hypnotized. Through some deduction, Nancy finds out about the schemer's operation, Three Branch Ranch, and how they meet and leave notes for their victims in the walnut grove around Blackwood Hall. Miss Putney is poisoned by the mediums against Nancy and wants nothing to do with her. Nancy begins to think there is a hidden elevator in Blackwood Hall, allowing the ghosts to appear and disappear. About this time, the crooks emerge and try to leave her in the elevator with dangerous fumes. Nancy stops the bottle with a piece of her clothing, is rescued, and the bad guys are caught. So I came up with a newspaper headline synopsis that kind of just sums this whole book up, and what I came up with is Spooks Can't Stop Her, Nancy Drew busts group of scamming spiritualists. So I thought it was kind of funny that Nancy gets stuck in an elevator in this book, not because she got stuck in it, but funny because I keep having dreams every so often where I guess because I've been reading these books so much and replaying the games and everything that it just creeps into my subconscious. And so my husband said that the other night I must have been stuck in an elevator because he was like, the way you were talking in your sleep, it made no sense, but it was pretty funny. Now, I did take down some direct quotes and things that I just thought were funny from this book, so we'll go ahead and jump right into those. So my first note is Nancy mentions Togo, her dog, on the first page, and here he is called a fox terrier. But I think it's so cute in some of these last few books that I've been reading that Togo is taking a bigger role because I love him. I'm kind of a dog person myself. And I always thought that Togo was kind of an odd name for a dog as a kid, and I had one of these kind of worlds colliding moments earlier this week. I was watching a video about Balto and the 1925 epidemic where they had to run medicine to people. And one of the dogs that ran the most perilous part of the journey before Balto was Togo. So I thought that was kind of a cute little detail, and that explains why Nancy named her dog Togo. At the time that some of these books were written, that would have been like 10, 20 years ago, so it was more relevant back then, but kind of one of those things that sort of gets lost to history. So the next note that I took down is Nancy tells Bess she needs to go to New Orleans to find a tall, dark man, and Bess says, "What would Ned say to that?" I just thought it was funny because Bess is always like checking Nancy. She'll be like, "Why are you flirting with this guy?" Or "Why are you, you're going to break Ned Nickerson's heart." So I thought that was kind of funny. Now, this next note has to do with what else but George fat-shaming Bess. So George makes a snide remark about Bess taking on 5 pounds eating New Orleans seafood. And I said, I think George needs to take a high five to the face. Because I'm sorry, part of traveling is getting to enjoy the local cuisine. So George, you need to just shut up and sit down. Now, I loved the fact that Nancy, Bess, and George went to New Orleans, but they attend a spooky seance at the Church of Eternal Harmony, and a portrait of a woman, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but Amura, supposedly comes to life, and the girls also go to get their pictures taken by a spiritual photographer, and Nancy's comes back developed with the words, "Beware your client's request." And Nancy sees the woman from the plane who was following them earlier in the day, and the light in the studio goes out, and it says Nancy felt a clammy hand brush her face and then fumble for her throat. And I was just like, ugh, that's so creepy. But when George finally gets the light back on, Nancy is gone and the photographer is unconscious. So this was a very cool scene in the book. It was very creepy. I live for these types of books, and where they kind of bend what you think is possible. And I mean, it's always explained later on, like, this is how these villains tricked you. But for a second there, you're like, this is spooky. Like, maybe there is something to this ghostly presence. Now, this next part is crazy, but Bess and George go to get a policeman and they search the building and they can't find Nancy. So, lacking any better plan, they go back to their hotel room. And this next part is a direct quote, but listen to how calm Nancy is. So, Nancy tottered in, her hair was disheveled and her clothing wrinkled and soiled. Wearily, she threw herself on the bed. She greeted them with a wan smile. "Hello." And then she just goes on to explain how she was carried from the room with a wet cloth on her face, probably with chloroform or something to knock her out, and taken to a basement of a vacant house and bound hand and foot. Oh, that was so, like, Like, if that were to happen in today's time, Nancy would not come waltzing back into a hotel room. Like, that's just terrifying. So, the next note that I have down is Bess mentions that she's worried about someone she knows and gives Nancy a side quest. And the woman who cleans their house, Miss White, has a daughter named Lola White. So her father went into a sanatorium, and Lola has become sad and has stopped giving her mother money from her job, which it's interesting. Like, in this book, there's a lot of people that are Nancy, Bess, and George's age who give money to their parents, I guess because they're still living at home and they're, kind of being supported by their parents, but they're also helping them out. But I was like, that in itself isn't very odd, that she just stops giving her mom money because, there's a leave and cleave at some point in your life, right? So, but anyway, that was considered odd by her mom. But Bess, has Nancy check out Lola White, and she does admit that there's something weird going on. Now, the next note that I took down just says, Miss Putnam says she received a message from the beyond about burying her jewelry near 3 crossed twigs in the wood, and Nancy is suspicious and comments nature wouldn't have left sticks like that. And they capitalized the word nature, which I thought was interesting, but it's so sad throughout most of this book. Miss Putnam, this elderly widow, her husband, died not long ago, and these people are using her to their advantage to get money from her. It's so messed up. But Nancy's trying to help her to see that, these spiritualists don't have her best interests at heart. Now, this next thing that I wrote down is just interesting little tidbit of information, but Ned apparently drives a green sports car. So Nancy has the blue Roadster and Ned has a green sports car. So this next note says, Nancy also sees a girl that looks like Lola leaving an envelope of money in a tree, but it is signed Sadie. The envelope gets snatched from right above their heads by someone in the tree. So it's later revealed that the metal object that Nancy saw in the beginning of the book, I think it's like I don't know, they call it some kind of a magician's hook. And someone is just snatching this money right over their heads. I don't know how they got away. I'm like, that's a bit of a stretch. But yeah, this group of horrible people are having these vulnerable people leave them money in this tree. It's pretty messed up. The next thing I took note of, this was a very creepy scene, but Nancy and Ned go to a sundown picnic, which seems, kind of romantic for them, and they see Lola wading into the river in a trance, talking about the beckoning hand. This was pretty creepy for a Nancy Drew book, because most of the time, things are easily explained. She's obviously been hypnotized to the point where she thinks that she's safe, and here she is wading into this river about to drown. They end up saving her and pulling her into their boat, but that was pretty intense. Now, Miss Putnam, the elderly widow that Nancy's trying to assist, was advised by mediums who were channeling her husband to invest in 3 Branch Ranch stock. Try saying that 5 times fast. But I wrote down that she saw nothing wrong when she got a note in her mailbox about attending a seance and getting in a car that would come for her. There's so many red flags. Like, please, if someone approaches you and says, I believe that your your dead husband or your dead, any kind of relative is talking to you, like, mm-mm. And then to get in a car and not even know where you're going, like, gave me the. So the next thing that I took note of is Nancy tries to lure Sadie out by putting an ad in the paper saying if she's blonde and knows of a certain walnut tree, a gift awaits her there. So the girls get 12 letters back, and George says, "Jumping jellyfish, how many walnut tree Sadies are there in this town?" I just thought that was funny, walnut tree Sadies, but most of these letters that they get back are pranks, but one of them is real. So the real Slim Sadie does show up, but they talk to her for a second and then she runs away. So the next note that I have, Nancy decides to write a fake note with bad grammar signed Ruby Brown to try and lure out the thief by putting it in the tree. And at about the same time, Nancy learns that Blackwood Hall is supposedly haunted by Jonathan Humphreys, who is a man who was killed in a duel underneath a walnut tree near the property. So Nancy goes to investigate the home, and they hear organ music, and they see this ghostly figure, like on the cover of the book. Like, I love old houses, but if something like this happened while I was at one, I'd be like, nope, I'm out. So Ned, who is ever the gentleman, suggests that he and Nancy take a boat to Blackwood Hall, but in a plot twist, they get there safely, only to fall in quicksand. So they didn't have a boating accident, but they did get stuck in quicksand, and they were just barely able to get out of it. The next thing that I wrote down is Nancy, Ned, and Carson go to investigate Blackwood Hall, and Nancy finds a secret door behind the organ and goes through it. At the end of a tunnel, she finds another door and sees a green light, and a ghostly figure slaps her flashlight out of her hand. So Nancy also sees an apparition go through a wall. It's just like, Like, the Zillow listing for this house has got to be outrageous. It's like, may have some haunted specters in some secret passageways, and just a whole lot of nope from me. So this next part of the book, Nancy, Ned, and Carson conduct a fake seance and convince Sadie to come to it by sending her a letter, and they convince her to not give any more of her money away. So they're kind of trying to combat these villains who are using these seances on people who are very susceptible to this kind of manipulation. And like, on the one hand, I don't really agree with it, but on the other hand, I'm like, if it gets them to stop giving away their hard-earned money to these criminals and crooks, then I guess it can't be so bad. But they go all out with it. They use, some special effects and some different techniques, and they really scare Sadie straight. The next thing that I wrote down is Nancy follows a lead and ends up in the woods and goes missing as George sees smoke coming out of a small cottage, but it's not on fire. It was apparently a special effect. We'd learn about this later in the book. But Bess goes for help, and Hannah brings Togo and one of Nancy's shoes to see if he can sniff her out. I thought this was so cute. This is what I meant earlier. Like, Togo is starting to have a bigger role in the books than I could have ever imagined. It's so cute. So at this point in the book, Nancy starts coming after the gang that is cheating people out of their hard-earned money. And it says, the young detective made such an impressive presentation of the facts that she was promised that a cordon of troops would be assigned to the lake area that night. So she appeals to the police department, and they are just so taken by what she has to say that they're like, all right, well, we'll just get this many member of the force, and we'll just have them come down there and stake out this house. Like, in what other universe would the police department listen to an 18-year-old girl? None. It's sad, but none. So the next note that I took down is that Lola is in some kind of a trance and is calling herself Violet Gleason, and she's become a maid for Miss Putney. So Nancy and the girls fake a seance to snap her out of it. And I was like, this is wild. Like, the fact that she's hypnotized to this degree, that she is calling herself by another name. She's actually gone out and gotten a job. Like, I know some people in a regular state of mind that can't seem to do that. Like, low blow, but still, I mean, like, that is some impressive hypnotizing skills. So the next thing that I wrote down is apparently one of the schemes of Three Branch Ranch is that they train orphans to contact the spiritual world. And I was like, this seems like, I don't know, like the plot of some book. Maybe there's probably something already out there that's like that. I mean, isn't Mrs. Peregrine's, like, school for ordinary children? I don't know what it's called. I feel like they have some, interesting powers, but that really stuck out to me. The next note that I took down is that the Brex brothers are responsible for scamming people, and about the time Nancy suspects a hidden elevator in Blackwood Hall, it opens up as she's searching for it in the hall, and the Brex brothers grab her. So then they leave Nancy in the elevator to die with poisonous fumes, like at least that didn't happen in my dream, but they just leave her there. And after she gets out with the help of Carson, Bess, and George, they find out that Ned radioed the police, and so they caught the criminals, and Nancy finds a secret room off the elevator shaft, and she's able to recover Miss Putney's jewels. The one bright spot in this scenario is that Nancy survived, and they were able to get this poor woman's jewels back because she's just been manipulated throughout this entire book. But it's weird because the room where they find the jewels, I took a note of this, but they spell mannequin weird. There's a dummy, like a mannequin, in this room, and they spelled it Manikin, and I was like, that has to be spelled wrong. I've never seen it spelled that way. But apparently, according to Google, that refers to a medical dummy, not like a clothes mannequin. I learned something today. So for the next segment of the podcast, I call this What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, and I've noticed a trend throughout the last few books. They've gotten to be way more vague, and they don't describe what Hannah cooks as much, but she did cook them a celebratory dinner, it says, but there were no details. And then she also made tea for Miss Putney because she was feeling faint and upset. Which, you know what, I like tea when I'm faint and upset too, or actually anytime. I'm a big sweet tea drinker, so... Now, as for the next section of this podcast episode, which I like to call Add That to Your Resume, I put that Nancy could say that she's a ghost's best friend / seance expert, because not only does she figure out the techniques that these people are using to scam these people out of their money, but she puts on a few seances of her own to kind of convince these people to go back to the way they were, and it's pretty wild. So now we're going to go on to the things that I liked about the Ghost of Blackwood Hall and the things I didn't like. So the things that I liked about this book were the haunts. Some of the ghostly apparitions would have been really freaky to have seen in person, but I also liked that this was a very realistic scam. I see versions of this scam like all the time, it seems like, in social media and different aspects of the world we live in, where it's just really sad, where people get taken advantage of and they get their money taken from them. But I also did like the setting of New Orleans. I have been to New Orleans 2 or 3 times, and it's one of my favorite cities. I think it's such a cool place. I also loved that there's a lot of good teamwork in this book. You have Nancy and Ned working together, Carson gets involved, and even Hannah and Togo, Bess and George. Like, it's just a huge team effort. But we also learned some more about River Heights. We learned about the origins of Blackwood Hall, and I thought that was just really neat. Now, for the things that I didn't like, I hated the part where Miss Putney was not wanting to believe Nancy. There was a part in the book where she just was like, I don't want you working on my case anymore, and I want you to leave me alone. And it was so sad because I've seen people in that state of mind before where they know they're starting to come to the realization that they have been scammed, but they want to cling to that denial because it's easier to be in denial than it is to admit that you've been taken advantage of, which is so sad. But I didn't like that part. I was like, oh, what's Nancy gonna do? Obviously, Nancy ignored her and continued to work on the case. But I also put that I wanted a few more spooks. I wanted a few more, like, scary moments. Like, there were plenty in this book, but I would have been fine with a few more. Now, I know you all are dying to know what my book rating is for The Ghost of Blackwood Hall. I gave this book 4 magnifying glasses. This was a very well thought out book. It was good. It was very realistic, which sometimes I like the books that are a little less realistic. That's not like a no-go for me. I do like some of the whimsical books that are a little bit far-fetched, but this book had a great plot and it had a lot going for it, so for that reason I gave it 4 magnifying glasses. So yeah, that concludes my review and this episode for The Ghost of Blackwood Hall. Next week's episode, we're going to be talking about The Clue of the Leaning Chimney, and this is episode 30. Like, I can't believe we're on the 30th episode already, and we're already like through 20-something of the books. I mean, it's been so fun talking to you all about these different plots and the covers, and I'm just so glad that you all are here and a part of this community with me. So thanks for listening, and until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.